Before we continue, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any stories that defy logic, time, and silence. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Your city may hold mysteries as unsettling as the one we are about to reveal. The Winchester Mystery House didn't impress with its height or elegance. What dominated those who approached was a sense of error, as if that building had been erected in defiance of some invisible rule. The walls multiplied at improbable angles, the windows opened onto internal corridors, and doors led to sudden falls or solid walls. Nothing there seemed accidental, but neither did it obey logic. Ethan Caldwell realized this even before crossing the main gate. He didn't come out of curiosity or fascination. He came because he needed to. A historian specializing in problematic architectural heritage, Ethan accepted projects that others refused, places marked by accidents, rumors, bankruptcies, or abandonment. His work consisted of assessing structural and historical risks before properties were reopened to the public, a technical, rational job that demanded emotional detachment. That's how he liked to define himself: technical, rational, distant. On the other side of that house was something that couldn't be catalogued with drawing boards or measurements. The very history of the place seemed to resist any attempt at ordering. Decades of continuous construction, orders given night after night, workers toiling without definitive blueprints, stairs that led nowhere, inaccessible rooms, passages sealed off soon after completion. The name Sarah Winchester appeared in every report like a persistent echo. A widow, heiress to an immeasurable fortune, isolated after successive family losses. The official version spoke of prolonged mourning and eccentricity. Unofficial versions mentioned fear, guilt, and an obsession with never allowing the house to be finished. Ethan parked the car and observed the building for several long seconds. The wind swept through the garden, producing a strange noise as it passed through the exterior structures, as if the house itself were breathing irregularly. He ignored the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach and adjusted his backpack containing measuring equipment. Inside the house, Clara Monroe was already waiting for him. Clara was the curator in charge of the place. Unlike tour guides, she wasn't keen on telling stories to visitors. Her job was to protect the museum's reputation, balancing enough mystery to attract visitors, but not so much as to provoke unwanted investigations. She knew every permitted corridor and carefully avoided those not shown on official maps. The contrast between the two was evident from the first glance. Ethan carried data, deadlines, and reports. Clara carried silence, caution, and an uncomfortable familiarity with the place. Without many words, she led Ethan through the house. The floor creaked under each step, not randomly but almost rhythmically. The walls bore the marks of old modifications, layers upon layers of hastily made decisions never revised. In some places, the natural light simply disappeared, even in the middle of the afternoon. Ethan began recording measurements, making quick notes, taking photos. Everything seemed structurally stable, and that in itself was strange. Such a chaotic construction shouldn't hold up like that after so many years. No critical errors, no obvious flaws. As they moved forward, something caught their attention: locked doors that weren't listed in the inventory. Clara would change course whenever they approached them, altering the route with vague justifications. The house seemed to offer too many options, as if it were testing choices. In a narrow hallway, Ethan noticed recent marks on the floor, almost imperceptible. They weren't old. Someone passed by there frequently. "That area is not part of the tour," Clara said, before he could ask. Ethan wrote it down anyway. The feeling of being watched didn't come from shadows or obvious noises, but from the irregular organization of the space. The house seemed to react to their presence, revealing passages and hiding others as they advanced, as if there were an internal logic that didn't accept external interference. The conflict was established, even though neither of them verbalized it. Ethan needed to understand and record it. Clara needed to keep certain things out of the realm of reason, and the house, silent and expansive, seemed poised to test how far each person was willing to go. The Winchester Mystery House didn't reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly, as if choosing what to allow to be seen. As Clara led Ethan through less visited areas, the flow of tourists receded, replaced by a denser silence, broken only by the distant sound of wood reacting to changes in temperature. The interior bore clear marks of late 19th century American history. Stained glass imported from Europe, custom-made floors, antique nails mixed with structures reinforced decades later. Everything coexisted uncomfortably. There was no clear timeline, only overlapping layers of decisions. Ethan began to realize that the environment directly influenced the behavior of the people who worked there. Employees avoided certain corridors without being able to explain why. Doors that remained open one day would appear closed the next, with no record of maintenance. Small changes that, in isolation, seemed irrelevant, but together created a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Clara walked ahead with calculated steps. Her familiarity with the house didn't come from maps, but from habit. She didn't consult signs or records. She just followed paths that seemed correct. And there was something in her posture that betrayed constant vigilance, like someone who learns to move without drawing attention. Gradually, Ethan began to notice signs of the presence of other people besides the official staff. Cups left behind in rooms off the tourist circuit, dust recently removed from surfaces that theoretically didn't receive visitors. These weren't random intrusions. There was a pattern to them. Clara's past emerged only in fragments. She had taken on the curatorship years before, after a restoration project that was never fully completed. Her connection to the place went beyond the professional. It wasn't emotional attachment in the common sense, but a kind of silent responsibility, as if she had accepted a task she couldn't abandon. Ethan, for his part, began to move away from a purely technical approach. The house challenged his professional parameters. There were no clear records of certain extensions, nor corresponding municipal permits. In California's public archives, parts of the structure simply didn't exist on paper. Yet they were there, solid and functional. The American cultural influence of Sarah Winchester's time was evident. The constant fear of loss, the guilt associated with prosperity built on the death of others, the belief that incessant work could ward off tragedies. The house seemed to embody this mentality. To grow, never to end. To build, never to rest. Secondary characters emerged discreetly. A night watchman who avoided working alone. A restorer who refused to enter certain rooms. A former municipal engineer who abandoned the project after insisting that some measurements were not repeatable. The antagonism didn't manifest as a clear figure, but as resistance. The house didn't physically impede Ethan, but created subtle obstacles. Spatial confusion, lapses in orientation, the persistent feeling of being late, even without a defined deadline. Every decision made, there seemed fraught with consequences. At the end of that journey, Ethan understood that he wasn't just analyzing a historic building. He was dealing with a living system of accumulated choices, human, cultural, and perhaps something more, that still influenced everyone who walked its corridors, and Clara knew this from the beginning. The first obstacle didn't appear dramatically. It came as a simple mistake, or something that should have been simple. Ethan realized that the orientation sensors installed in his equipment began to provide divergent readings within the same ward. Distances that didn't coincide, angles that varied with each measurement. He repeated the procedure more than once, changing the reference point, but the results remained inconsistent. The house did not conform to the pattern of repetition. Clara watched from a distance, without interfering. When Ethan suggested recalibrating the devices outside, she agreed too quickly, as if she had expected it. However, upon returning, the path seemed different. A corridor that had once been straight now had a slight curve. A door that should have led to a staircase ended in a locked room. It wasn't a change obvious enough to cause immediate alarm, but it was enough to shatter Ethan's confidence in his own spatial memory. Tensions rose when he decided to explore a wing not listed on the official maps. The place was clean, artificially lit, and clearly in use. There was no accumulated dust. This indicated frequent traffic, something incompatible with the museum's institutional narrative. There, the first direct conflicts between Ethan and Clara arose. She didn't prevent entry, but positioned herself to limit progress. Each step taken seemed like a silent negotiation. The house narrowed the corridors, reduced options, and forced quick choices. Secondary characters began to influence the conflict more actively. The night watchman, unexpectedly encountered during the day, warned Ethan not to stay after closing time. There was no explicit threat in his words, only a poorly disguised urgency. The restorer requested a temporary leave of absence on the same day that Ethan registered that irregular wing. The obstacles are no longer just spatial, they've become human. Documents requested by Ethan began to disappear. Digital files exhibited selective glitches. Old reports contained gaps precisely during the most critical periods of the house's construction. Someone or something was controlling the flow of information. The pressure mounted as Ethan progressed. The more he tried to impose logic, the more the house reacted incoherently. There were no explicit signs of danger, but the psychological strain was constant, a feeling of always being watched, of making wrong decisions without knowing why. Clara, for her part, was beginning to show cracks in her controlled demeanor. Her presence became more frequent, as if she needed to monitor Ethan's movements. At times, she seemed to protect him. At others, she seemed to restrain him. The central conflict was solidifying. Ethan needed to reveal the structural and historical truth about the Winchester Mystery House. Clara needed to prevent certain areas and what they represented from being brought to light. And the house, silent, continued to impose new obstacles, adjusting itself to human attempts to understand it, as if it were always one step ahead. Subplots began to emerge almost imperceptibly, like cracks that only reveal themselves when the structure is already under pressure. Ethan began to notice that the museum's routine followed rigid patterns, not out of efficiency, but out of necessity. Schedules were adhered to with excessive precision. Certain areas were only accessible at specific times of day. There were no clear administrative justifications for this. One of these subplots was revealed through the night security guard, Mark Sullivan. Officially, he only worked after closing time, but Ethan encountered him again during the day, discreetly exiting through a side door not shown on the maps. Mark avoided eye contact and quickened his pace. Hours later, Ethan learned that this door led to a series of corridors used only for internal checks. Another layer emerged with the departure of the restorer, Helen Ruiz. Before leaving, she had left Ethan an incomplete note in a physical report, something rare in that digitized environment. The text mentioned temperature differences in certain rooms, variations too rapid to be natural. The note ended abruptly, as if it had been interrupted. Clara began to act under pressure. Her control over the situation was no longer absolute. She started to establish clearer boundaries, restricting areas without offering explanations. Conversely, there were moments when she led Ethan to specific locations, almost as if she wanted him to see only carefully chosen parts of the truth. The house, in turn, intensified its influence. Doors that were once accessible now appeared sealed. Small detours became inevitable. Time seemed to behave strangely inside. Clocks differed from one another, and quick visits stretched for hours without anyone noticing. The time pressure began to manifest itself when Ethan received a warning from the state administration. The final report had to be delivered before the initial deadline. There was no formal request, just a curt communication with no room for negotiation. The work needed to be completed far too quickly to be safe. The subplots silently converged on the main conflict. Mark avoided certain shifts. Helen stopped answering calls. Clara became increasingly vigilant. The house responded with increasingly restricted pathways. Nothing there was accidental. Every choice seemed anticipated. Every delay was punished with new obstacles. Ethan realized he wasn't just racing against an institutional deadline, but against something that had been operating within the institution for much longer, something that wouldn't tolerate complete exposure. The turning point didn't come with a shock, nor with a spectacular event. It came with a simple and irreversible realization. During a last-minute authorized night inspection, Ethan realized that one of the interior corridors didn't exist in historical records or recent architectural surveys. It wasn't a forgotten old extension. It was something that shouldn't be there at all. The structure featured modern materials mixed with 19th century techniques, as if it had been built in incompatible temporal layers. Clara followed him in silence. Unlike other occasions, she did not try to deviate from the path. The corridor ended in a narrow, windowless room, marked by symbols carved directly into the wood, repeated geometric patterns, all slightly imperfect. There was no sign of wear. It wasn't old, nor was it recent. It was continuous. There, Ethan found physical records that had never been digitized. Construction notebooks signed by different names over the decades, all describing similar orders. Build without finishing, modify without recording, seal without destroying. No author remained the same for very long. They all abandoned the work. The central revelation came when Ethan compared dates. Construction hadn't ceased with Sarah Winchester's death. It never had. It had merely changed hands. Clara broke the silence directly for the first time, not to explain, but to confirm. She wasn't just a curator, she was a guardian. There was an informal succession of those responsible for the house's balance, people in charge of keeping certain areas active, certain routes open, certain spaces inaccessible. The house didn't expand on a whim, it expanded out of restraint. The true antagonist revealed itself at that moment. It wasn't Clara, nor a figure from the past, nor even an obvious supernatural presence. It was the very need to keep something trapped, hidden within the distorted logic of the construction. The house functioned as a mechanism of eternal postponement. Ethan understood too late. By documenting, measuring, and trying to organize, he threatened to disrupt a balance maintained for over a century. Every useless corridor, every door leading nowhere, existed to prevent access to something that could not be confronted directly. The turning point came when Clara offered her a silent choice: to continue and face the consequences, or to accept the limitations and leave. The house awaited. The consequences began to manifest immediately, without fanfare. After the discovery of the corridor and the records, Ethan's access to certain areas was officially restricted. There was no direct confrontation, only new protocols, new keys, new authorizations that never arrived on time. The system reacted like an organism that identifies a threat and isolates the source. Clara began to accompany him on almost all his journeys. Her posture was no longer one of discreet restraint, but of constant vigilance. Even so, there were clear signs of internal conflict. In brief moments, she hesitated before closing a door or blocking a path, as if calculating the weight of each decision. The staff changed too. The night security guard requested an immediate transfer. Helen confirmed her permanent departure from the project, sending one last short message without explanation. Their distancing wasn't just fear, it was understanding. They knew their limits. Ethan didn't. The house intensified its influence in a more direct way. Small changes became inevitable. Hallways seemed longer than the day before. Sounds of footsteps emerged in empty areas. The lighting only flickered during moments of greatest tension. Nothing explicit enough to generate panic, but enough to maintain a constant state of alert. Ethan reacted insistently. He began to record everything manually, outside of official systems. Photographs, hand-drawn maps, physical notes hidden off-site. Each of his actions generated an almost immediate response from the house, as if the space were reorganizing itself to hinder further discoveries. Relationships deteriorated. Clara stopped offering implicit explanations. Conversations became functional, short, devoid of any attempt at mediation. The fragile trust that existed between them broke down, replaced by a tense coexistence. The most significant consequence was internal. Ethan realized that his presence was no longer neutral. He had become part of the system he was trying to analyze. The house wasn't observing him, it was reacting to him. The balance had been disturbed, and now each step forward demanded a higher price. Overcoming the challenge didn't begin with sudden courage, but with adaptation. Ethan understood that insisting on traditional methods only provoked more aggressive responses from the house. Digital maps failed, precise measurements contradicted each other, official records were quickly annulled. To move forward, he would need to change his approach. He began to observe patterns instead of seeking exactness. He noted the times when certain corridors seemed more accessible, moments when doors remained unlocked for longer periods. Instead of forcing entry, he waited. The house, paradoxically, seemed to respond better to patience than to direct confrontation. This change reflected visible growth. Ethan stopped acting as an outside technician and began behaving like someone learning the inner workings of a hostile system. His decisions became more cautious, more strategic. He no longer confronted the space. He negotiated with it. Clara noticed the transformation. Constant vigilance gave way to silent observation. At times, she wouldn't interfere when Ethan approached sensitive areas. At other times, she offered subtle detours that he now understood as warnings, not arbitrary blocks. New challenges arose. The house began to test different limits. Corridors that only opened in a specific sequence, staircases that required an immediate return to avoid losing the entrance's reference point. Ethan failed a few times, but he learned quickly. Each mistake had consequences, but none were definitive, as long as he respected the imposed rhythm. Personal transformation solidified when Ethan relinquished the need to reveal everything. For the first time, he deliberately left a space untouched. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some areas didn't require a solution, only containment. This growth wasn't resignation, it was maturity. Ethan understood that his role there wasn't to win the house, but to prevent the balance from being broken by ignorance or arrogance. By accepting this, he ceased to be merely an investigator. He became an active part of the invisible structure that kept that place functional, albeit incomprehensible. The build-up to the climax wasn't announced with explicit urgency, but with silent acceleration. The patterns Ethan had learned to recognize began to condense. Windows of opportunity became shorter. Sequences that had previously worked now demanded absolute precision. The margin for error decreased. The subplots began to unravel naturally. The state administration sent confirmation that the report would be finalized internally, without external reviews. The security guard's transfer was completed. The restorer's removal became permanent. The circle of people involved narrowed until only the indispensable remained. Clara led Ethan to a wing that wasn't on any version of the maps, nor even in the old physical records. There was no explanation, just the clear choice to move forward. That decision ended any remaining ambiguity between them. The rhythm of the house intensified. Construction sounds emerged at improbable hours. There were no workers, but hammers echoed in the distance, rhythmic, constant. The walls vibrated slightly, as if adjustments were being made in real time. Ethan realized that certain areas were beginning to align. Doors that had never connected before now created a continuous path. Stairs without function gained temporary purpose. The house was organizing itself not to be understood, but to guide. The final preparations required quick choices. Ethan discarded secondary records, keeping only the essentials. Clara sealed off access points that could never be reopened without consequences. There was no discussion. Both understood that this stage left no room for doubt. The tension grew without any pause for reflection. Every move seemed definitive. The house offered no more alternatives, only advance or retreat. And retreat was no longer a viable option. Everything converged on a single point, still hidden but inevitable. The climax began without warning, either audible or visual, only the certainty that there were no more alternative paths. The route the house had laid out led Ethan and Clara to a narrow staircase, built with steps of irregular heights, forcing a specific pace of ascent. To miss a step meant losing alignment. At the top, they found a space that defied all previous logic. A large, symmetrical, stable room. No useless doors, no false windows. For the first time, the house seemed complete. In the center, a simple structure, a newly built wall, still exuding the scent of cut wood. There were no symbols, no warnings. Only the confirmation that something had been sealed there not long ago. The turning point came when Ethan realized that the most recent records listed his own name as the technical manager responsible for the latest structural modification. Not as an administrative error, but as a continuation of the previous arrangement. The house had recognized him as the successor even before he had accepted. The central conflict was resolved the moment Ethan understood the ultimate choice. Breaking down that wall wouldn't liberate what was contained, it would. The balance wouldn't be destroyed, only transferred to another place, another form, another consequence. The protagonist's transformation became visible in the action. Ethan didn't try to open it, he didn't measure, he didn't document. He reinforced the structure, he adjusted the seal. He finished what he had started. The house responded with absolute silence. The climax didn't end with an explosion or escape, but with stability. The postponement mechanism remained intact, now under new responsibility. The final consequences did not manifest themselves immediately. In the days that followed, the Winchester Mystery House resumed an almost normal appearance. The flow of visitors was re-established, the official itineraries remained unchanged, and no extraordinary announcements were issued. To those observing from the outside, nothing had changed. Internally, however, everything was different. Ethan stayed for a few more weeks, finalizing a report that would never be published in its entirety. The document delivered to the authorities was technically correct, carefully incomplete. No outright lies, just strategic omissions. The house remained classified as structurally stable, historically relevant, and safe for controlled visitation. Clara continued as curator, but her role was no longer solitary. Decisions became shared. Certain access points were jointly restricted. Others were temporarily granted according to standards recognized only by them. The house no longer required constant surveillance, only continuous attention. The relationships between the characters found a new balance. There was no celebration nor complete relief. There was understanding. Ethan did not return to his former life. His old projects were rejected one by one, not because of incapacity, but because of incompatibility. He now carried knowledge that could not be applied in ordinary places. In the long run, the building responded with stability. No new corridors appeared unnecessarily. No wing was abruptly reorganized. The postponement mechanism worked as it always had, invisible, efficient, silent. The protagonist's journey ended without classic redemption or tragic punishment. The surprising ending lay in acceptance. Horror did not need to be defeated to be controlled. And the night inside the Winchester Mystery House continued, not eternal but carefully contained. Months later, a visitor noticed something strange during one of the last visits of the day. In a dimly lit corridor, A door that had previously led to emptiness now remained firmly sealed. There was no explanatory sign, nor any indication on the map. As the visitor passed by, he felt only a slight pressure in the air, as if something had been prevented from moving forward. In the curator's office, a new record was filed, signed with 2 initials. The house remained silent. If this story sparked unease, curiosity, or discomfort, those reactions are part of the experience. Places like the Winchester Mystery House remind us that not every mystery needs to be solved. Some exist to be understood from a distance. Share in the comments what you would do in Ethan's place. Would you try to reveal everything, or would you accept maintaining the balance? There are decisions that seem small, but carry profound consequences. If this story has captured your attention, follow the channel for more stories that explore the boundaries between reason, silence, and what we choose not to confront. Each reading is a new path, and not all of them lead back.